Howdy, historians. Mr. Montgomery coming to you live and direct from room 112 with today's flip lesson about constitutional issues and the Lincoln-Douglas debates in Unit 5, Part 1, the causes of the Civil War. Three big people that we'll talk about here on our title screen today that you'll see later in the presentation. The reminders, you know them, but let's go over them. It's okay to have a little bit of repetition in our lives. Define the vocabulary associated with this unit, this lesson, or at least refresh yourself on that vocabulary if you have defined it already. Make sure you take notes as we go and pause, rewind as need be. Take advantage of the functionality of the functions of the flip lesson. And then answer the wrap-up questions after watching and bring all this stuff to class. Bring your notes, bring your questions, bring your sheet. Take some time on question number 2 in the post-lesson assessment questions. It's a fun question if you let it be and a really good thought exercise. So take some time on question number 2, which I know you will because you are one of the enlightened because you're in this class and you're at DSHA. Here we are on the outline. Again, Unit 5, Part 1, the causes of the Civil War. We've seen how the Civil War is on the horizon with the conflict over territories and the slavery question, the Compromise of 1850, all of these various issues of slavery, how the parties are in crisis. We've been talking about extremists like John Brown and the caning of Senator Sumter. Now we're going to look at 2 constitutional issues, the Lecompton Constitution and a Supreme Court case, Dred Scott v. Sanford in 1857. And then we'll also see the Lincoln-Douglas debates. We're going to see Abraham Lincoln burst onto the national scene with his very high and nasally voice against Stephen Douglas. I wish we had a recording of Lincoln, but I think we'd all be underwhelmed because they said that he actually maybe wasn't the best speaker because he had a high nasally voice, and sometimes he was a little flustered at the beginning, but he was a great writer and a lover of logic. But we will get more on that later. So let's go ahead and hop into it. Get ready, get your pen or pencil ready, get that fresh page in your notebook, and here we go. The first constitutional issue that we want to talk about is the Lecompton Constitution. A little bit of background. 1856, we have a presidential election, and President Buchanan comes in. He's going to have a very rocky presidency. He goes down as one of the worst presidents ever because he didn't do a lot to try to stop the coming of the Civil War, but that was kind of the way that he saw things. He didn't want a huge action. He wasn't very aggressive. He thought that rational, logical debate would eventually solve the issue of slavery. He also really wanted the Supreme Court to eventually decide it, which they tried to, but they did so in not the best way in the Dred Scott decision, which we'll see later in this lesson. So he comes in, and one of the first challenges that he faces is a constitution coming out of Kansas. It's known as the Lecompton Constitution. Now that we know Lecompton is the pro-slavery capital of Kansas, so some pro-slavery forces drafted this constitution, and Buchanan's got to try to balance northern interests, southern interests, the expansion of slavery. He's not going to be able to do it very well, and the Lecompton Constitution is a good example of this. So this constitution comes out of Lecompton. It did not have the support of the majority of the settlers. What the pro-slavery forces in Lecompton did is they put forth this constitution, and they put this dirty little trick in there, kind of. Whether you voted yes or no for the Constitution, if you approved the Constitution or you didn't, there was a little provision that anyone with slaves in Kansas already would be able to keep their slaves. So basically, no matter how you voted on the Lecompton Constitution in Kansas, you'd be voting for slavery and the preservation of slavery in Kansas. So what the Free Soilers did, what the anti-slavery forces did in Kansas, is they just boycotted. They didn't vote. Well, by not voting, the pro-slavery forces were able to get this Constitution passed. Now, people in Congress, in the House, in the Senate knew this, like Stephen Douglas knew this, and he actually fought against the Lecompton Constitution because it went around popular sovereignty and it wasn't fair. That's the way that he really saw it, is that it wasn't a fair vote because of the little trick in there that no matter how you voted, slavery would be preserved in Kansas. So Buchanan actually put all of his weight behind this, and he wanted Congress to accept the Constitution. People usually called him a Northern Democrat, but a Southerner in spirit. He was from Pennsylvania, Northern Democrat, but he's kind of a Southerner in spirit, and he didn't quite understand the full picture of the slavery issue. But he wanted Kansas to just be made a smaller territory and come in as slave and the Constitution to be accepted. But Stephen Douglas and others fight against it. And there was a lot of public outcry over the Lecompton Constitution because people knew that it was shady. And eventually Congress does not accept it. They kind of have Kansas re-vote on it, and in 1858 it's fixed up a little bit, and the pro-slavery document was overwhelmingly defeated by the majority of Kansas settlers. And Kansas actually is going to be a territory all the way until 1861, even though it had enough people to be a state. When eventually the southern states secede, Kansas will come in as a free state. But what we saw with the Lecompton Constitution is that Buchanan may not be nimble enough and agile enough to handle the slavery issue during his presidency. It also started to split Northern and Southern Democrats because, of course, Southern Democrats wanted the Lecompton Constitution to be accepted. Northerners like Stephen Douglas did not. So we're starting to see the Democrats, the only true national party at this time, start to split. Because if we look at that election map, you can see the Republicans are very regional. There's the American Know Nothing Party, or the Whig Party, that is totally dying out, very small amount of the popular vote and the electoral vote. So the Democrats are the party, but they're not as strong as they look, and we're starting to see some splintering, and we're eventually going to see a big split before the election of 1860. So Lecompton Constitution, important aspect to kind of see the start of the start of the split, of the Democratic Party. I just paused the video there, took a nice sip of LaCroix for all my LaCroix lovers out there, for all my LaCroix haters. Get some more mature taste buds. All right, next thing, Dred Scott v. Sanford. Sanford, we got a typo up here. Let's just fix that. Boom, Sanford. There we go. Now it's all set and it's recentered. All right, Dred Scott v. Sanford, 1857. A little bit of background here. So the Dred Scott case is going to be a Supreme Court case. What's happening here, Dred Scott is a slave. He had been a slave in Missouri, and he was taken to Illinois and Wisconsin. He lived in Illinois for about 3 years and Wisconsin for 2 years before returning back to Missouri with his owner. So Scott, backed by some abolitionists, sued for his freedom. He claimed that because he lived for 5 years in states where there was no slavery, that made him a free citizen. So the case makes it all the way to the Supreme Court. Chief Justice Roger Taney is a Southern Democrat. The majority of the Supreme Court are pro-slavery Southerners at this time. So the argument is made, Scott lived in 2 different free states for 5 years of his life, he should be free. But the Supreme Court, headed by Taney, rendered his decision in March of 1857. Now, his decision has a couple of different pieces. The decision is against Scott for the following reasons. So the court says, 1, Dred Scott has no right to sue in a federal court because he is a slave and slaves are not citizens, and the Supreme Court can only be used by citizens of the United States. So Scott can't sue in federal court because he's a slave, he's not a citizen, he can't use the Supreme Court because he's not a citizen. Next, they could have just stopped right there. They could have just thrown the case out right there. But they went further. They wanted to have more of a final narrative here on slavery. And the majority of the court pushed for this. The 2 free soilers on the court were appalled by this. But they went further. Instead of just throwing it out by saying Scott isn't a citizen, in part 1 of the decision, they go into part 2 of their decision. So part 2, it says, Congress doesn't have the power to deprive any person of property without due process of law, 5th Amendment. And because slaves are property, then Congress cannot exclude slavery from any federal territory. So basically what they've done by saying that is now slavery is legal in every single territory, every single state across the United States. Part 3 of the decision, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which excluded slavery from Wisconsin, Illinois, and other territories, is unconstitutional. So the Supreme Court has gone way overboard here. They could have just said, Scott's not a citizen, he can't sue, goodbye. But instead, they're trying to have a final decision here to the slavery question. And they're basically going to make it legal everywhere. So as you could imagine, the reaction to this is extreme on both sides. Southerners were absolutely delighted when they got news of what happened in the Dred Scott decision. Northern Republicans are absolutely shocked and angry. because the Supreme Court had basically ruled that all parts of the territories were open to slavery. Republicans denounced the decision as, quote, the greatest crime in the annals of the Republic. Many Northerners were upset by this too, and Northern Democrats were upset by this, like Stephen Douglas. And many people even started to go to the extreme thought that maybe this was some type of conspiracy by the Supreme Court. But there was just outrage on all sides. The Northern Democrats are upset. Republicans are upset. Southern Democrats are delighted. And this again shows that the Democrats are weak and they're starting to split. There's going to be Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats, and that's going to have a big impact on the election of 1860. You know, we talked on the previous slide about how hard Buchanan's presidency was because he had to walk this tightrope of pro-slavery, anti-slavery. The Dred Scott decision came in 2 days after his inauguration, right? So that's really tough sledding for him. But now things are getting heated. I mean, this is basically a political civil war in Dred Scott versus Sandford and that decision. So the Supreme Court has made their policy known, and things are starting to heat up. So those are two huge constitutional issues. Now, on the road to secession, eventually the election of 1860 is going to be big. But we've got to see where Lincoln comes from, because Lincoln is kind of an unknown. As we look at the background here to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, it's the year 1858. Stephen Douglas is up for re-election as a senator from Illinois, and this relatively unknown trial lawyer from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, challenges him. So Lincoln wasn't very well known, but he challenged Douglas to a series of public debates. And Douglas was known as the best debater in the entire country. He was known as the little giant. He had this booming voice. He was a very good speaker. So he quickly accepted. So Lincoln and Douglas go around. They have this series of debates. You can see the map here in 1858. And as they're going around, Lincoln is starting to really make a name for himself as a good speaker. You know, he was more of a moderate than anything else who was opposed to the expansion of slavery. But people were reporting on this across the country and started to learn a little bit about who Lincoln was during these debates. He had said he had made some statements that scared the South. Like he said, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. He had also had a famous speech called the House Divided speech, in which he said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. This government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. So he had started to make some headlines with some of his speeches, but it was the Lincoln-Douglas debates that really brought him on to a national level. Now you can see I've got Freeport circled in here because at Freeport, Illinois, Lincoln challenged Douglas on how he could reconcile popular sovereignty with the Dred Scott decision. And what became known as the Freeport Doctrine, Douglas responded that slavery could not exist in a community if the local citizens didn't pass and enforce laws for maintaining it. Because again, he's pro-popular sovereignty, and this was a stance that many Northern Democrats had taken. They said, listen, if the people don't want slavery, they won't pass laws protecting it. And that's something that we've actually kind of seen. If the people don't support a law, it's pretty hard for it to be a law. So Douglas didn't see this as a big issue, but Southern Democrats did. When Southern Democrats heard about his statement at Freeport, which became known as the Freeport Doctrine, they felt that Douglas didn't go far enough to support the implications of the Dred Scott case. So this series of debates was well known. It was well publicized. Douglas actually ended up winning his re-election for senator in these series of bouts and debates, but in the long run, he lost ground in his own party by alienating Southern Democrats and even some Northern moderates. On the other hand, Lincoln emerged from the debates as a national figure and a leading contender for the Republican nomination for president in 1860, and it again shows the split that's on the horizon for the Democrats. So Lincoln is rising to prominence, Douglas is splitting his base. We have people upset about the Dred Scott decision. There are still all kinds of problems in Kansas, and Buchanan is probably inadequate as a president to be able to handle this very complex issue of slavery and its expansion in the United States. So things are heating up here in the road to the Civil War, and we're going to see a few more things happen before the election of 1860, but the election of 1860 is really going to be the last straw. There'll be some more violence on the road to secession, but then when Lincoln eventually comes in as president, the South will have no more and will secede from the United States. So good job today. Remember to answer those questions. If you have the post-unit questions, if you have any questions, bring them to class so we can have a good discussion tomorrow. And really try to think about a good answer to question number 2 on your post-assessment wrap-up. Great job today, historians. I will see you.